Once upon a time, in a small town nestled in the heart of the forest, a group of friends gathered for a weekend camping trip. They set up their tents and started a campfire, sharing stories and laughter under the stars, but as the night grew darker, they began to feel a creeping sense of unease. They heard strange noises in the woods, whispers that seemed to be coming from just beyond the trees. As they huddled closer together, they suddenly heard a twig snap. The group fell silent, their eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement, and then, out of the shadows, stepped a figure. He was tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes and a crooked smile. He wore a faded leather jacket and a pair of worn boots. The group froze as he approached them, his hands hidden in his pockets. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Mind if I join you?" They didn't know what to say. Something about him seemed off, dangerous, but before they could answer, another figure emerged from the woods. This one was shorter and stockier, with a wild look in his eyes. He carried a hunting knife in one hand and a grin on his face. "Looks like we stumbled upon a party," he said, his voice slurring. "Mind if we have some fun?" The group tried to back away, but the two strangers advanced on them. They were trapped, surrounded by the killers. The tall one, the one with the leather jacket, spoke again. "You see, we're not like other people," he said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "We like to play games, and you're our newest players." The group screamed as the killers closed in on them, their laughter echoing through the woods. The night was long and dark, and the screams never stopped. The tall one was named Jack, and he was the leader of the killers. He had grown up in the forest, surrounded by violence and death. His father had been a hunter, and he had taught Jack how to track and kill prey from a young age. Jack had never known anything else, and he reveled in the thrill of the hunt. The shorter one was named Ray, and he was Jack's protege. He had come to the forest seeking refuge from his troubled past, and Jack had taken him under his wing. Ray was eager to please his mentor, to prove that he was just as capable of violence as Jack was. He had a deep-seated need for approval, a craving for the kind of power that only killing could provide. Together, Jack and Ray were a deadly duo. They roamed the forest, seeking out victims to satisfy their twisted desires. They enjoyed the hunt as much as the kill, taunting their prey and toying with them before finally taking their lives. The group of friends had been their latest victims, but they wouldn't be their last. Jack and Ray were hungry for more blood, more screams, more power. And they would stop at nothing to get it. The forest had never been a safe place, but now it was truly terrifying. The killers were on the loose, and no one was safe. The people of the town whispered in fear, locking their doors at night and avoiding the woods at all costs. They knew that Jack and Ray were out there, somewhere, waiting for their next prey, and they knew that it was only a matter of time before they struck again. As the days passed, the fear in the town only grew stronger. People began to report strange sightings in the woods, shadows moving in the darkness, and whispers carried by the wind. The police had launched a manhunt for Jack and Ray, but they had proven elusive, leaving no traces behind. Meanwhile, Jack and Ray were still on the hunt, driven by a hunger for power and control. They moved with ease through the forest, their senses honed by years of hunting. They knew the forest better than anyone else, and they used that knowledge to their advantage, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers. One night, as they lay low in a secluded cabin, Jack turned to Ray with a grin on his face. "You know what we need?" he said. "A bigger challenge, someone who's really worth our time." Ray's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "Yeah," he said, "someone who's not afraid to fight back, someone who can give us a real run for our money." They both laughed, the thought of a worthy opponent filling them with excitement. They knew that finding such a person would be difficult, but they were determined to try. Days turned into weeks, and the manhunt for Jack and Ray showed no signs of slowing down. The police were closing in, but the killers remained elusive. And then, one night, they found their next victim. She was a young woman, out for a jog in the woods. Jack and Ray had been watching her for days, stalking her from the shadows. They had been impressed by her strength and determination, her fearlessness in the face of danger. As she ran through the forest, they sprang from the trees, knocking her to the ground. She fought back, kicking and screaming, but they were too strong. They dragged her away, deep into the heart of the forest, where no one could hear her cries. For days, they toyed with her, testing her limits, seeing how much pain she could endure. but she refused to break, refused to give them the satisfaction they craved, and then, one night, she saw her chance. As they slept, she crept from her bonds, moving silently through the cabin. She found a knife and held it tightly, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. She knew that this was her only chance, her only hope for escape. She crept up to Ray's sleeping form, the knife raised high, and then, just as she was about to strike, she hesitated. She looked down at him. Really looked at him for the first time, and she saw something in his eyes, something that made her pause. It was fear, real fear, and it shook her to the core. She realized then that these were not monsters, not truly, they were human beings, with their own fears and doubts and weaknesses. They had been twisted by the forest, by their own pasts, but they were still human. In that moment of hesitation, Ray stirred. He opened his eyes and saw her standing over him, the knife in her hand, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled. "Go ahead," he said, "do it. You're stronger than us, you've won." And she realized then that he was right, she was stronger than them, in more ways than one. She dropped the knife and ran, out of the cabin, out of the forest, back to the safety of civilization. Jack and Ray were caught soon after, brought to justice for their crimes, and the town breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that they were finally safe from the killers in the forest. But for the young woman, the memory of those days in the woods would never fade. She had seen a darkness in herself, a willingness to do whatever it took to survive, and she had seen a glimmer of humanity in her captors, something that she had never expected. She spent years trying to come to terms with what had happened to her, seeking therapy and support from loved ones, but the experience had changed her, leaving her with a sense of unease that would never fully go away. As for Jack and Ray, they spent the rest of their lives in prison, haunted by the memories of their crimes. They had been blinded by their own twisted desires, unable to see the humanity in their victims or in themselves. In the end, the story of the killers in the forest served as a warning to others, a reminder that even the darkest of desires can take hold in the human heart, and that sometimes, the only way to overcome them is to find the strength to see the humanity in others, even in the face of unimaginable horror. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other. The houses were evenly spaced, with well-manicured lawns and white picket fences. The residents were a close-knit community who often gathered together for holiday parties and barbecues. However, behind closed doors, there was a dark secret lurking. No one suspected that the friendly neighbor next door was actually a serial killer. He had managed to evade suspicion for years, blending in seamlessly with the community. He was a well-liked member of the community, always willing to lend a hand when someone needed it. However, there were some signs that things were not quite right. For instance, he was always very private and never wanted to talk about his personal life, despite the tight-knit community. There was a growing sense of unease among the residents. They couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the days went by, the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker and more palpable. People started to notice strange things about their neighbor's behavior. For example, he would often leave the house at odd hours of the night, and his car would be gone for hours on end. Some neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from his house at night, like muffled screams and thudding sounds. Another neighbor claimed to have seen him digging in the woods behind his house late at night, but when confronted, he brushed it off as a hobby of his. These strange behaviors only added to the tension and unease felt by the community. Then, one day, the police made a shocking discovery. It all started when a group of kids stumbled upon a shallow grave in the woods behind the neighborhood. The police were called, and soon they uncovered more and more bodies buried in the same area. Each victim had been brutally murdered, their bodies left to decay in the dirt. The entire community was left in shock and disbelief that such a heinous crime could have been committed right under their noses. As the investigation intensified, it became clear that the killer was someone that the entire neighborhood knew. Everyone was on edge, wondering if their friendly neighbor could be capable of such heinous acts. Rumors swirled, and people began to look at each other with suspicion. The once friendly and trusting community was now filled with fear and distrust. People were afraid to go outside, and many were even afraid to stay in their own homes. The killer remained at large, and the community was gripped with fear. People no longer felt safe in their own homes, and parents kept their children indoors. The police set up roadblocks and conducted door-to-door searches, But the killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. The once peaceful community was now a place of fear and chaos. Finally, a breakthrough came in the form of a tip from an unlikely source. It was the victim's pet dog that led investigators to the killer's home. The dog had been found wandering the streets, and a microchip scan revealed that it belonged to one of the victims. This led the police to search the killer's house, where they found evidence of his crimes everywhere. There were blood stains on the walls and floors. And the stench of decay was overpowering. The killer himself was nowhere to be found, but the evidence was enough to put him away for life. It was revealed that he had been living a double life. By day, he was a friendly neighbor who waved hello as he mowed his lawn, but by night, he was a sadistic monster who preyed on innocent victims. His facade had fooled everyone, and the community was left reeling from the shock of it all. The community struggled to come to terms with the fact that they had been living next to a monster for years. The killer was eventually caught and convicted of his crimes, but the community was forever changed. People no longer felt safe in their homes, and they were hesitant to trust their neighbors. The once close-knit community became fragmented as people struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The community was left with a sense of grief, anger, and betrayal. They had lost their sense of security, and they struggled to move on. In the weeks that followed, the community came together to mourn the loss of the victims and to support one another. There were vigils held in the victims' honor, and the families of the victims were inundated with cards and flowers from well-wishers. However, the community was still reeling from the trauma. People often looked over their shoulders, wondering if there were other people like him living amongst them. The once quiet streets were now filled with the sounds of locking doors, security systems, and the occasional police car. Despite the sense of unease, the community tried to move on from the tragedy. The neighborhood watch program was revamped, and residents were encouraged to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. The police department also increased its presence in the area and provided self-defense classes to the community. The houses that were once filled with families were now empty, and the once vibrant community was now a shadow of its former self. Years went by, and the community slowly began to heal. The killer's house was demolished, and a memorial was built in its place to honor the victims. The community also came together to plant a garden in the woods where the killer had buried his victims, turning a place of horror into a place of peace. The garden was a symbol of hope and healing for the community. They refused to let the tragedy define them. The memory of the serial killer next door still lingered, but the community had learned to live with it. They had learned that evil could be lurking just around the corner, but they had also learned that they were strong enough to overcome it. They had learned to be more vigilant and to look out for each other. They had become a community that refused to let tragedy define them. The community was now stronger and more united than ever before. They had survived the unimaginable, and they were determined to never let it happen again. The tragedy had brought the community together in a way that they never thought possible. They had learned that even in the darkest of times, hope and healing were possible.